In many ways, it was the settlers who were more colonialist than the government was.
People tend to forget what Japanese did to indigenous people. They took away the land from indigenous people without any compensation. The modern order is constructed on the basis of the sacrifice of indigenous people.
It was through this process of multiple colonizations that Taiwanese identities really were created.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Tomasz Koper, sitting in for Divya Gopalan. When most people think about Taipei, what comes to their mind is Taipei 101 or the chaos of shop signs and billboards. But a quick stroll around the central neighborhood where many of the country's ministries and government institutions are located will leave you with a very different impression. This style of colonial architecture can still be seen in many cities across Taiwan and is often used for infrastructure and government purposes. This is the material legacy of Taiwan's colonial past, left behind by the Japanese who withdrew from the island in 1945. Before Japanese, it was China's Qing Dynasty, and before them it was Ming loyalist forces of Zheng Chenggong, and before that it was the Spanish and the Dutch. And to this day, many argue that Taiwan's colonial history did not end in 1945 but continued under Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang. To help us untangle Taiwan's complex colonial history, we welcome to the show Professor Evan Dawley, joining us from the US. He's a professor at Goucher College. And in Taiwan, we're joined by Professor Daya Dakasi from the National Chengchi University. Daya, I mentioned this string of colonial rulers of Taiwan, but what does colonialism mean to your community, to the indigenous community?
Yes, I think that's a period after period of settler coming to Taiwan, and the government and the settler took the land from indigenous people, and also hugely changed our way of living, our culture, and our self-governance over our land. I think that's the most significant influence from the colonialism.
Well, to this day, I know many indigenous people use two names. Is that right? You yourself also use Daya Dakasi, but you also have a Chinese name. Is that considered a part of this colonial legacy?
Yeah, definitely. Like my grandmother was born in Japanese era, so she had a Japanese name, and of course before in his village, her own village, she had indigenous name, but then the Japanese gave her a Japanese name, and after the coming of KMT, she had to shift to Han Chinese name. So in her life, she had three names. And that's very common to all indigenous people, because after one region after another, we are required to change our way of speaking our language and also our way of naming ourselves.
Well, Evan, you studied Japanese colonial rule over Taiwan. What stands out to you when it comes to the Japanese rule as opposed to other colonial periods in Taiwanese history?
Oh, that's a really great question. And thank you, Thomas. I'm happy to get to be here today. So what stands out for the Japanese colonialism is, in some ways, its self-consciousness. The Japanese regime very much identified itself as a colonial regime. And also, from the very beginning, one of the goals of the Japanese regime was to sort of create Taiwan as a model colony. They did a lot of research looking at British colonies and French colonies, the United States and the Philippines, and they self-consciously wanted to sort of do a better job of it, if you will. They wanted to make Taiwan a profitable colony from their perspective. Now, in order to make it profitable, they had to really sort of run it on the cheap, as it were, and to extract as much as they could out of the people in the land. So I guess that's one of the things that makes the Japanese colonial regime, a little bit distinct from the Qing regime, certainly, and most definitely from the KMT regime, which neither of them really identified themselves, I think, as colonialist.
It's been my impression that the Japanese are still remembered pretty fondly in Taiwan compared to other colonial periods because of the contributions to infrastructure, schools, roads, railroads, the energy grid. So is that also part of that model that they wanted to introduce in Taiwan?
Yeah, I would say definitely that another one of the distinctive features was the very again, self-conscious effort to as they saw it, modernize Taiwan, to introduce a lot of new infrastructure. And there really was tremendous urbanization that occurred during the Japanese period. And that urbanization brought with it roads and electricity and new plumbing systems. There had certainly been some of that going on, especially in the late years of the Qing Dynasty. But the Japanese regime really did do a lot more of that sort of construction. Maybe most famously, some of the irrigation systems down in the southern part of the island, electric generating plant at Sun Moon Lake, right? There was a lot of effort to do those sorts of projects. And I mean, they did have a real impact.
Aurora Zhang is a human rights activist, and she gave us this take on why so many people in Taiwan feel nostalgic about Japan's colonial rule over Taiwan.
I actually really do think that it has to do with the fact that when the KMT came over, like after the Japanese, when you replace one colonial master with another, and when the aesthetics and the history of like these colonial legacies kind of like contrast against each other so much, it makes it very easy for people to kind of misplaced nostalgia onto Japanese, like our Japanese colonial period, because, you know, we went through White Terror, we went through martial law under the KMT, and through democratization, what the KMT stands for. The ROC, like kind of that level of brutality. You see people being a lot more lenient with Japan.
So, Evan, do you agree with this idea about why Taiwan has this, as we've heard, colonial nostalgia for Japan? Or do you think that we should look elsewhere for the reasons for that?
I think there's a lot in what you said that I would agree with in terms of the nostalgia that a lot of people do feel for the Japanese period, or at least that appears as you wander around the streets of Taipei, right? You mentioned a lot of the government buildings, but you also see a lot of these sort of commercial establishments that are in renovated Japanese buildings. So a lot of that nostalgia, I think, as she pointed out, has a lot to do with the way in which the KMT established control over Taiwan in the late 40s and early 50s. I was doing a small research project looking at the memories of the 228 incident from 1947 and how that incident became a really important feature in the formation of Taiwanese identity. And because of that particular memory, the memory of the Japanese period sort of seemed, I don't know, perhaps a little more moderate by comparison.
Well, Daya, do the indigenous communities here in Taiwan also see this contrast between the Japanese rule and the KMT rule? And what kind of attitudes is that producing in people?
Yeah, I think firstly, somehow I also know that especially for the elder generation, they tend to, memorize the Japanese era. I mean, contrast to what happened after KMT came. But I would also like to say for the overall Taiwanese people, they have this kind of nostalgia to Japanese era. That is because Japan, they finished or they done the basis for the modern order for Taiwan. But at the same time, people tend to forget what happened Japanese did to indigenous people. Like they took away the land from indigenous people without any compensation. They nationalized all the mountain and the forest as national property without recognized indigenous people over the forest and mountain. And after that, KMT government continued the process. The mountain and forest mostly are still nationalized nowadays, and indigenous people had very few right to access to the forest and the mountain, and also for the plain area for the East Coast. For example, the Japanese, they took a lot of land for the sugar cane plantation, and after KMT came, they just have a nationalized company to took over all the property from the Japanese, including the land they took away from indigenous people. So I think yes, in one hand, Japanese did they contribute to finish the basis, or they had the basis for the modern order, but the modern order is constructed on the basis of the sacrifice of indigenous people. And nowadays, I hope, and I believe that there is an effort in Taiwan try to go back to the history and find some the historical to figure out what are the historical injustice happened before, and try to find some way to fix that.
Well, one thing that surprised me when I started learning about Taiwanese politics is that the indigenous community, the majority of the people in the community vote for KMT, or tend to vote for KMT in the elections, which I found surprising given the colonial history, or the history after 1945. Can you shed some light on that, Daya?
Yes, I think there are many reasons. That first, I think because after World War II, Taiwan was in a region of totalitarian, right? So there are a lot of political brainwashing for the indigenous community. So I think that's one of the major reasons. And secondly, the KMT government, they established a very sophisticated system for channeling or transferring the public resources to the indigenous area. And that was the time there is no big division between the KMT party and the government and the state. So that make the elder generation, especially, they feel, oh, it's the kind of benefit we receive from KMT. And another reason I think that's very historical and cultural or ethnic relation, that because especially during the Qing Dynasty, there were a lot of conflict between Han Chinese settler and indigenous people. It was the time of settler colonialism. So the settler invade into the indigenous area for like logging or tea growing, or they grape the land from indigenous people. So there were a lot of negative experience. But after World War II, the new wave of immigrant from China, they call it 外省人, which means people from foreign province, from the province other than Taiwan. They are not from Guangdong or from Fujian. They are for indigenous people, they are not those who came to grab the land like the Guangdong or Fujian people. So that make the elder generation feel more closer, or have some kind of compassion or sympathy to those people from foreign province, the veteran. So I think there are some very interesting or subtle ethnic relations that make indigenous people also feel more closer to KMT, which representing the interest of people from the foreign province.
Well, it seems like it's a very complex issue. Yes, Evan, you wanted to add to that?
Well, I just wanted to say, two things. One, I was really interested in learning a little bit more about the post-1945 relations. This is an area that I'm still trying to learn a bit about. So thank you, Daya, for sharing all that. There was a real distinction between the Qing dynasty and the settlers who were coming from Fujian, from Guangdong to Taiwan. Those settlers were often in conflict with the Qing state. Tomas, you gave this list of colonial regimes in the beginning of your talks, but in many ways, it was the settlers who were more colonialist than the government was. By which I mean the Qing dynasty put in place at least some policies that were designed to protect indigenous lands or to prevent encroachment on indigenous lands, with drawing boundary lines on maps and trying to, in some ways, preserve indigenous land ownership. I think it was probably more complicated than I'm laying it out there, but the Qing dynasty was trying to limit conflict between the Han settlers and the indigenous populations, but it was in some ways those settlers who were more actively colonialist, if you will. During the period before 1895.
Agreed. Yeah.
It seems that it's a very complex issue with many different factors that are not always taught in schools. Well, according to a recent study that we found during our research, 25% of surveyed students in Tainan said that they had significant lacks in the knowledge about Taiwan's colonial periods. Daya, as in your experience as an educator, as a professor, do you encounter students who really don't know enough about Taiwanese colonial history to really appreciate the complexity that's in there?
Okay, I would like to say that honestly, the educational system in Taiwan is changing. During the period when I was elementary school, we had a fewer knowledge about what happened in the history. But in the past few decades, that the educational system in Taiwan is changing, try to include more history in the educational material. But still, I would like to say it's not enough. Historical textbook tend to give the history that is like prehistorical or very early stage in the history book need to put in more history or experience to show that indigenous people are still struggling. And before that, I would say yes. Most of the students in Taiwan, they are still in lack of the full knowledge of what happened in the history.
Well, I would like to shift gears to healing and processing this generational trauma of colonialism. But before we get to that conversation, I want you to take a look at this. Writer and art curator Sasha Dees recently organized an exhibition called Nexus at Taipei's Museum of Contemporary Art. It aimed to showcase the art and artists from the former Dutch colonies in the Caribbean who, much like their Taiwanese counterparts, still deal with colonial legacies. Take a look.
And I had done research in the Caribbean and written a book, and a friend of hers that is a mutual friend knew about the book and suggested that she should read it and that maybe an exhibition about the Caribbean would be interesting. I realized in thinking about it that I, being from the Netherlands, are really the connection between Taiwan and the Caribbean, as being a descendant from one of the colonizers in the 17th century of both some islands in the Caribbean and of Taiwan. I hadn't realized that at the time there were 14, and by now there are only 13 countries that recognize Taiwan as a country. 4 of those are in the Caribbean. It's important to realize that. Because, although a lot of attention is on America and Europe and China and Russia, your friends are actually different countries that maybe you don't always think about. So the moment you actually saw people from the colonized countries themselves to start writing, like C.L.R. James or Fanon or Glissant, Césaire, I mean, lots of writers started writing and being read in a bigger context. Making those connections, maybe you think like you're this small Taiwan, but you're actually part of that large history.
Daya, I would like to ask you, what are some of the ways in which Taiwanese people are processing this trauma of colonization through art or through other means?
I think the artwork is very important for people to go back to the history and show their feeling, express their feeling, and that's a very important step for healing.
Evan, you wrote a book, Becoming Taiwanese, on the formation of Taiwanese identity, including the colonial period. In your research, where have you found the remnants of the colonial period in how the Taiwanese view themselves today?
Well, so I would say that it was through this process of multiple colonizations that Taiwanese identities really were created. That it was this, for the people that I write about, and mostly what I write about is people who are descended from Hokkien settlers in the city of Geelong, and so northern Taiwan urbanites is mostly who I was writing about. Their sort of multi-generational experience of having been settlers in Taiwan and then having been colonized by the Japanese and then recolonized by the KMT was absolutely essential for their process of identity formation. But as I also argue in the book, that process was in many ways explicitly separate from or explicitly excluded, indigenous populations. It was very much a set of experiences that were specific to that component of the population of Taiwan, and it did not really seek common cause with indigenous populations.
Do you see any influence of this colonial legacy on cross-strait relations, for example, how people in Taiwan view themselves, compared to China?
I'd say very quickly just a couple of things. One is that because of that really negative experience with the KMT in the late 1940s and then under martial law, I think that experience heightened a sense of separation from China and made people in Taiwan feel more distinctively Taiwanese, I think.
And Daya, before we finish for today, do you see any threads that connect the Taiwanese colonial history and the remnants of this colonial legacy and how people see themselves and view themselves, and what happened in other parts of the world? After all, Taiwan was not the only colony that existed in this period.
Firstly, I would like to respond to Ivan that I think the cross-strait relation also influenced Taiwan indigenous people a lot, especially after the democratization process. Taiwan tend to have a new national discourse about who we are, and that gives indigenous people an opportunity that we can be the core of nation building instead of being a very bolder or a marginal ethnic group of China. So that's a good opportunity for indigenous people in Taiwan. And we actually see that in many cases that the current government try to encourage or support indigenous people to go abroad, to go to the Pacific, to build a connection or cultural exchange with especially for the Austronesian language speaking people, so that we can contribute to connecting Taiwan with the world. So I think that's a good thing, but I also see a challenge that we need to be very careful not to fall into the situation of cultural appropriation. That we have to be very clear that when Taiwanese people or Taiwan government or the state try to, get benefit from indigenous people's connection with the Pacific, should also show more respect and pay more attention to go back to the history and for reconciliation and for a more justice future. And to compare Taiwan indigenous people and other indigenous people in the world, I think every indigenous people in every country do have different domestic context, struggling with their domestic situation. But I also feel that we do share some common challenge. For example, how to tangling with the government, how to balance our tradition and modern situation. So I think we are looking for more connection with other indigenous people in the world to share our experience and to learn from each other, and also try to build a network to support each other.
Well, I really hope that we will see, as you say, Daya, a more just future for indigenous people and everyone else. Thank you, gentlemen, for being panelists on the show today. It's been a great lesson in colonialism and history in Taiwan. Once again, thank you to Professor Evan Dawley joining us from the US from Goucher College, and Professor Daya Dakasi from the National Chengchi University in Taiwan. And to our audience at home, it's been great to have your company. Goodbye and stay connected.